She was sitting at my table when I arrived, not waiting at the bar, not at a separate table, at my table. The specific table I had used for 11 days running in the same cafe on Malastrana Square, the table in the northeast corner, back to the wall, sightlines to both the entrance and the service door. The specific table that the formation uses in any cafe it treats as an operational regular. The table I had never told anyone about. The table that was mine, because I had claimed it by 11 days of consistent use. Not because anyone had assigned it to me, or documented it, or communicated it through any channel that could have been intercepted. She knew which table. She was sitting in my chair. I stopped at the cafe entrance for 1.8 seconds. Not 11. Not the threshold for catastrophic information processing. 1.8 seconds. The formation's threshold for threat assessment in a confrontational contact scenario. The difference between 11 seconds and 1.8 seconds is the difference between a phone call at 0312 hours and a person sitting in your chair. The phone call gives you time to count. The person in your chair requires you to decide before you finish reading the situation. I decided in 1.8 seconds. I walked to the table and sat down. Welcome to the Grey Prague, March 2007. 14 months after the Warsaw posting concluded and the Vistula registered at 0.7 meters per second through the December cold. 14 months during which the physical archive had continued growing. The web trajectory assessment had remained at 0.94, and the Walsh transition, the institutional departure that the Cairo emergency channel had initiated in February of 2004, and that had concluded in late 2004. With Walsh leaving her DIA analytical position, had produced a new operational variable that the archive had been tracking since early 2005. Walsh was no longer inside the institution. She was outside it, which meant the entity's institutional tools for managing her visibility, the specific tools that operated through personnel decisions and access reviews and professional network adjustments, the tools the entity had been deploying since November of 2003, when it identified her name, were no longer applicable. Outside the institution, Walsh was not subject to institutional pressure. She was subject to something else, and the something else had a name that the archive had been building toward since the first data point appeared in January of 2005. But I will come back to Walsh, because the woman sitting in my chair in Prague in March of 2007 was not Walsh. And who she was, and why she knew which table, and what she said in the first 40 seconds of our conversation, that is where this file begins. Her name, the name she gave me, which I later confirmed through the archive's cross-referencing system, matched her actual operational identity, was Marta, Czech, 43 years old. 17 years in the Czech intelligence service, the BIS Bezpečnostní informační služba, the domestic intelligence service that had been reorganized from its communist-era predecessor in 1994 and had spent the subsequent 13 years building the specific Western-oriented institutional culture that post-communist Central European intelligence services build when they have sufficient time and sufficient motivation. She was not a mid-level liaison officer like Wisniewski in Warsaw. She was senior. The specific quality of professional stillness that senior intelligence officers develop, not the compressed survival stillness of Dmitry Fedorov, not the gap-reading stillness of al-Rashid, something more institutional. The stillness of a person who has been in rooms where institutional decisions are made for long enough to know that decisions made in rooms leave traces, and that the traces are the most operationally valuable thing about any decision, she said. You have been in Prague for 11 days. You have used this table every one of those 11 days. You have a dead drop in the Josefov district. The specific location is in a wall in the old Jewish quarter, behind a memorial plaque that you identified on your third day and accessed on your sixth. You have been investigating a connection between the Warsaw facility you documented in 2005 and a logistics chain that passes through Prague's financial district. She paused, picked up her coffee, set it down. I am not here to threaten you. I am here because the chain you are investigating connects to something I have been investigating for 8 years. And because the person who is watching you, not me, a different person, and you will notice them in approximately 4 minutes if you begin. The standard counter-surveillance protocol from this table is not affiliated with the BIS or any Czech institutional actor. They are affiliated with the entity you have been documenting since Budapest in 1993. 40 seconds. She had given me more operational information in 40 seconds than the Warsaw posting had produced in 11 days of active surveillance. The formation processed it in the specific parallel way that the formation processes information delivered at unexpected speed. All of it simultaneously. Probability assessment running on each element independently and on the composite. The table knowledge, 0.91. She has access to the operational log or has been running independent surveillance on the posting. The dead drop knowledge, 0.88. She has either independent surveillance or a source inside the archive's access network. The Warsaw connection, 0.84. She has access to classified material that connects Warsaw to Prague in a way the operational brief does not contain. The entity affiliation of the watcher, 0.79, unconfirmed, requires the 4-minute counter-surveillance protocol to assess. I did not run the counter-surveillance protocol from the table. I ordered coffee, 90 degrees. The cafe's machine was correctly calibrated, second consecutive Prague morning, with correct extraction. No adjustment required. I drank the coffee and looked at Marta and said, "Tell me about the 8 years." She told me, and what she told me is the operational substance of this file. But before I give you the substance, I need to give you the context. Because the context is the reason the Prague posting exists, and the reason Marta knew which table, and the reason the entity had placed a watcher on the posting 4 minutes from where I was sitting. The context is Robert Hansen. Robert Hansen was an FBI special agent. He worked for the FBI for 27 years. He was a counterintelligence specialist, the specific FBI function whose purpose is to identify Soviet and then Russian penetrations of American intelligence and law enforcement. And for 22 of his 27 years, from 1979 to 2001, he provided the Russian SVR and its predecessor, the KGB, with classified intelligence that the official damage assessment described as the most damaging espionage case in FBI history. He gave the Russians the identities of Soviet and Russian assets working for American intelligence. He gave them classified technical programs. He gave them details of American nuclear war planning. He gave them the existence of a classified tunnel beneath the Soviet embassy in Washington that American intelligence had spent years and tens of millions of dollars building. He gave them everything. For 3 payments of cash and diamonds totaling approximately $1.4 million and a promise, never fulfilled, of a larger payment when he defected. He was arrested in February of 2001. He pleaded guilty to 15 counts of espionage. He died in prison in 2023. The FBI's official account of the Hansen case describes it as an intelligence failure, the largest in FBI history that produced institutional reforms, new personnel security protocols, counterintelligence oversight improvements. The official account is accurate in what it says. It is incomplete in what it does not say. What it does not say is the operational connection between the Hansen penetration and the institutional dynamic that the physical archive had been documenting since Budapest in 1993. I want to give you that connection. Specifically, because the connection is not intuitive and the official account is specifically constructed to make it invisible, Hansen was arrested in February of 2001. I was in Washington on the desk posting from 1999 to 2001. The posting that produced Catherine Walsh's first appearance in the third file, that confirmed the trajectory assessment on the entity's subject as a pattern rather than individual incidents, that placed the institutional obstruction documentation in the physical archive alongside the Ames period entries. The Hansen arrest occurred 7 weeks before the end of the Washington posting. I read the arrest report in the institutional feed on the morning of the 20th of February, 2001, and I sat with it for longer than 11 seconds. Because the Hansen arrest report contained a specific detail that the official account described as an operational security failure on Hansen's part, a detail that, cross-referenced against the institutional obstruction documentation in the physical archive, produced a specific finding that the official account did not reach. The detail was this: the FBI had been unable to identify Hansen as the source of the penetration for 22 years, despite specific indicators that a penetration existed. The inability was attributed, in the official account, to the specific difficulty of investigating a senior counterintelligence officer whose institutional access gave him the ability to monitor and manage the investigations that should have identified him accurate and incomplete. Because the physical archive's institutional obstruction documentation, built since 1993, around the Ames period delay, and its subsequent institutional iterations, contained entries that cross-referenced to specific decisions made within the FBI's counterintelligence management structure between 1995 and 2001 that had produced outcomes consistent with the pattern the archive had been documenting. Not Hansen's decisions made by officers in the institutional hierarchy above Hansen's operational level, decisions that had the effect, whether intended or not. And the probability assessment on intent had been running since 1998 of maintaining the conditions in which a penetration at Hansen's level could continue operating. This is the operational finding that the Prague posting was built around. Not Hansen himself. Hansen was arrested, convicted, imprisoned. His penetration had a resolution, like Ames's penetration had a resolution. The institutional dynamic that allowed both penetrations to continue for as long as they did the structural capacity for self-protective blindness that the Ames case had revealed and that the Hansen case had demonstrated again, in a different institutional context, did not have a resolution. It had a pattern. And the pattern's specific expression in the Hansen period institutional management had left specific traces in specific decisions made between 1995 and 2001 that the physical archive had been cross-referencing since the Washington posting ended. The Prague posting was the operational environment in which one of the people connected to those specific decisions had established a professional presence in 2007. Not an operational posting. A private sector position, the specific kind of institutional transition that occurs when a senior intelligence officer retires from government service and moves to the private sector in a role that maintains the institutional relationships and operational access that the government position had provided, without the official accountability structures that the government position had nominally imposed. Prague, in 2007, was home to a specific cluster of private sector security and intelligence consulting operations that had grown in the post-Cold War Central European institutional environment operations that maintained relationships with both former communist-era intelligence services and current Western-aligned services that facilitated the specific kind of institutional information flow that the post-accession Central European environment produced. One of these operations was connected through a specific financial chain that the Warsaw Archive entry had partially documented in 2005, and that Marta's 8-year investigation had been tracking from the Czech side to the entity whose trajectory assessment was at 0.94 and whose subject had been walking through cafe doors in Cairo and Warsaw. Now, I will come back to Marta, because the 4 minutes she had specified elapsed while I was processing the Hansen connection, and the standard counter-surveillance protocol from the table produced a specific result in the protocol's first phase. The watcher was in the cafe, not at a table. At the bar, at the end nearest the entrance, a position that provided sightlines to the northeast corner table without requiring a direct orientation toward it. Male, approximately 40 years old. Professional bearing. Not check the specific quality of a person whose relationship to the environment they are operating in is professional rather than habitual. Eastern European background, but not Czech or Slovak, the accent audible in a brief exchange with the barista. The specific consonant quality of a Southern Slavic first language overlaid with a professional Western European vocabulary. The probability assessment on entity affiliation, 0.76. Marta's advance assessment had been 0.79. The convergence was itself a data point, two independent observers. Different methodologies, approximately the same result within a 3-point margin. I looked at the watcher for approximately 0.4 seconds, not the 0.8 seconds of direct acknowledgement that Warsaw had produced. 0.4 seconds of professional registration, the observation that leaves a trace in the operational log rather than a trace in the interaction. The watcher registered my registration and moved his attention back to the bar, not a retreat, a professional acknowledgement of the mutual observation that did not require escalation. The specific behavioral signature of someone who is conducting surveillance at a professional level, not attempting to confront or intimidate. Information collection, not management. The entity had a watcher on the Prague posting. The watcher was professional. The watcher was collecting, not managing, which meant the entity had assessed the Prague posting's operational objective, the financial chain, the Warsaw connection, the Hansen period institutional decision documentation that the posting was building toward as something that required monitoring rather than intervention. The documentation was still below the threshold. The entity was still watching rather than acting, but the margin was narrowing. 0.76 for the watcher's entity affiliation versus 0.79 for Marta's assessment, both above the 0.67 action threshold, neither at the 0.9 confirmation threshold. The documentation was growing. The watcher's presence confirmed that the entity knew the documentation was growing. And the entity's choice to watch, rather than act, confirmed what Warsaw had confirmed. The documentation was not yet sufficient to require the entity to change its approach. What did Marta's 8 years produce? I am going to give you this in operational summary rather than operational texture, because the operational texture required 3 meetings across 4 days, and the meeting's specific content is in the physical archive rather than this account. The operational summary is this. The Czech BIS had been tracking a specific financial network since 1999, a network that connected post-communist Central European financial structures to a set of Western private sector entities whose principles were not disclosed in any public filing, whose operational behavior had characteristics consistent with an intelligence support function rather than a genuine commercial function, and whose connectivity to the CIA's post-September operational infrastructure, the BIS, had been building an evidentiary picture of since 2003. The picture was partial. The BIS had the Central European segment of the network, but lacked the Western segment. The Warsaw posting's financial chain, cross-referenced against the now.Schwat building's Delaware holding company ownership structure, was one specific node in the Western segment that Marta's 8-year investigation had been unable to reach from the Czech side. The Czech and physical archive cross-reference produced a composite map. Not complete, neither the BIS investigation nor the physical archive had the complete network. Composite. The composite showed a financial network that had been operational since approximately 1999, that connected the entity's institutional activities to a set of private sector structures that provided the specific kind of operational resource management that intelligence activities require when they are operating outside the ND. Official institutional frameworks that would normally resource them. The network was the entity's operational infrastructure. Not the entity itself. The entity was an institutional actor within the official framework. The network was the mechanism through which the entity's activities that could not be resourced through the official framework were resourced outside it. This is the specific operational finding that the Prague posting produced, and that the physical archive received across 3 dead drop exchanges in March of 2000, and 7 exchanges that used a location in the Hosefov Old Jewish Quarter that the posting had established on the 3rd day, and that the BIS surveillance had, as Marta had disclosed, independently identified. The dead drop location was compromised not by the entity, by the BIS investigation that had been tracking the same network from the other side. The location was changed on day 7 to a new location in the Vinohrady district that neither the BIS surveillance nor the entity's watcher had identified. Marta met me 2 more times. The second meeting produced the specific evidentiary element that the composite map had been missing, the identity of the private sector entity in Prague that served as the node connecting the Central European segment of the network to the Western segment. The identity went into the physical archive as a new entry, the first entry that connected the financial network to the trajectory assessment subject at a direct operational level rather than through the institutional decision. Pattern: direct, not circumstantial. A documented financial connection between a private sector entity whose principal was the trajectory assessment's subject and the network that the Warsaw Building's ownership structure had established as the entity's operational infrastructure outside official frameworks. 0.97. The probability assessment reached 0.97 with the Prague composite map entry, not the 0.98 that the Walsh-Ames compound confirmation had produced, 0.97, 1 step below, but operationally significant in a way that no previous probability update had been. Because the Prague entry was the first entry that connected the trajectory assessment's subject to the entity's operational infrastructure through a direct financial link rather than through the pattern of institutional decisions that had constituted the trajectory assessment's evidentiary basis since 1988. Institutional decisions are individually defensible. A financial connection to a covert operational infrastructure is not 0.97. The archive received it. The carrying structure held it. The threshold was closer than the Warsaw 0 and 8-second acknowledgement had mapped it. Now, Walsh, the specific operational variable that had been building since early 2005. Walsh had left the DIA in late 2004. She had moved to a research position at a university, the specific kind of institutional transition that allows an intelligence analyst to continue producing analytical work in a form that is nominally academic, but that maintains the institutional relationships and access patterns that the intelligence career had built. The research position was legitimate. The work was genuine. And the entity's institutional tools for managing Walsh's visibility personnel decisions, access reviews, professional network adjustments were no longer applicable. The entity had known this. The entity had been developing an alternative approach since 2005. The alternative approach was specific, and it was visible in the data points the archive had been accumulating. Not institutional pressure. Walsh was outside the institution. Legal pressure, the specific mechanism through which an institution can pursue an individual who is outside its institutional authority through the legal frameworks that the institution can access. Not criminal charges. The archive's contents were not in a form that would support criminal charges, and the entity knew this. Civil mechanisms, the specific category of legal instrument that can be used to investigate, to compel disclosure, to produce institutional attention on an individual without requiring the standard institutional evidentiary threshold that criminal processes require. The Prague posting's third Marta meeting produced a specific data point about the Walsh legal mechanism, not the mechanism itself, the mechanism had been visible in the archive since late 2006. A specific timeline. The entity's legal mechanism against Walsh was scheduled to be activated in the fourth quarter of 2007, 9 months away from the March 2007 Prague meeting. The timeline had been in the BIS investigation's peripheral data since 2006 because the legal mechanism's activation required preparation through the same financial network that the BIS had been tracking. Preparation that left traces in the network's activity patterns that the BIS surveillance had registered without fully understanding their significance until the composite map had provided the interpretive framework. 9 months. The documentation had 9 months to reach a threshold sufficient to produce the institutional acknowledgement that would make the entity's legal mechanism against Walsh operationally irrelevant, because an entity that is the subject of sufficient institutional documentation cannot use institutional legal mechanisms against the people documenting it without the use of those mechanisms becoming itself part of the documentation. The carrying structure had been building for the specific weight of this moment since Budapest in 1993, 14 years of one word at a time, one data point at a time, one posting at a time. The Prague finding moved the probability assessment to 0.97. The financial connection was documented. The timeline was in the archive. The 9 months were running. The Prague posting concluded on the 29th of March 2007. The Vltava River, not the Vistula, not the Nile, not the Bosphorus, but the Vltava, the river that Dvorak wrote a symphonic poem about, and that the city of Prague has been built around since the 9th century, moved through the city at approximately 1.1 meters per second on the morning of the last day. Colder than the Warsaw Vistula in October, warmer than the Warsaw Vistula in December. The specific mid-range cold of a Central European river in late March, the ice gone from the banks, the spring volume beginning to push the current faster than the winter measurement. The Vltava's color, gray-green in the morning light, the specific mixture of the Bohemian highland sediment and the early spring snowmelt that produced a color distinct from the gray-brown of the Vistula and the gray-green of the Nile. Different river, different geography, different sediment, the same formation requirement. Map the water. Filed. The physical archive received the Prague posting's final entry on March 27. The composite map. The financial connection. The 0.97 probability update. The 9-month timeline for the Walsh legal mechanism. All of it in the dead drop in Vinohrady that the entity's watcher had not identified. All of it documented and dated and cross-referenced. The archive growing toward the threshold that the entity's own acknowledgments Warsaw's 0.8 seconds. Prague's watcher presence and professional distance had been helping to map, and one more thing, something that the official record will never contain and that this account is transmitting for the first time. On the last night of the Prague posting, the 28th of March 2007, at 2,218 hours, a communication arrived through the Karim channel. Not a 4-word alert like the December 2005 warning, a full communication, 7 sentences. The communication described a meeting that had occurred in a city that Karim's channel did not name, between 2 individuals whose identities Karim's channel described through operational characteristics rather than names, in which a specific operational decision had been made. The decision concerned the Walsh legal mechanism's timeline. The decision was to accelerate the timeline from the fourth quarter of 2007 to the second quarter. 6 months, not 9. The archive had 3 fewer months than the Prague composite map had indicated. I sat with this for 11 seconds. Then I picked up the communication and walked to the Vinohrady dead drop for the last time and added the 7-sentence summary to the archive's Prague entries. The Vltava was 1.1 meters per second. The March night was 4 degrees Celsius. The breath vapor lasted 1.9 seconds shorter than Warsaw's 2.8 seconds. longer than Cairo's sub 1 second. The specific cold of a Central European late winter that is almost spring, but not yet. The carrying structure had 3 fewer months than the previous assessment had indicated. The archive was going to need to grow faster. The threshold was going to need to be reached before the second quarter of 2007, 4 months from the end of the Prague posting. 4 months to grow a documentation that had been building for 14 years toward the specific weight that the entity's own probability assessment had identified as the threshold the bank holds. It has always held. The water moves. The archive grows. The significance is no longer approaching from a comfortable distance. It is 4 months away, running at 1.1 meters per second through a March night in Central Europe. But I need to give you something before the Prague file closes that the operational summary has not yet contained. Because the operational summary gives you the findings, what it does not give you is the specific operational texture of the 11 days before Marta sat down in my chair. And that texture matters. Because it is the texture of what this career actually feels like from the inside of a posting that is building toward a threshold that is 4 months away, in a city that has been the operational center of Central European intelligence since the Cold War, with a watcher at the cafe bar whose presence confirms the documentation is still below the threshold, and whose professional distance confirms the entity has not yet decided to act. Prague, in March of 2007, had a specific quality that none of the previous postings had produced. Not the Cold War operational quality of Vienna or Berlin, not the post-Soviet collapse transitional quality of Budapest or Warsaw. Prague in 2007 was a city that had processed its Cold War history and emerged on the other side of it with a specific institutional confidence, the confidence of a city that had hosted the Soviet bloc's most sophisticated intelligence operations for 40 years and that had, since 1989, been building a Western-oriented institutional framework without losing the operational intelligence that 40 years of sophisticated adversarial presence had accumulated. The Czech intelligence service was not the largest or the best resourced in Central Europe. It was the most analytically sophisticated, the specific product of an institutional culture that had been forced under the communist regime to develop genuine analytical capability rather than relying on the coercive tools that larger services could substitute for analysis. The BIS had been watching the financial network that Marta described for 8 years. 8 years of analytical work from a service that had learned, under conditions that made poor analysis fatal, to do analysis correctly. I registered this on the first morning of the Prague posting, at 0700 hours, standing on the Charles Bridge and looking east toward the Old Town. The Vltava below at 1.1 meters per second, actually 1.3 meters per second on that first October morning. The autumn volume higher than the March departure measurement. The river in its fuller seasonal register. The specific Czech sandstone color of the Old Town facades visible across the water. The gargoyle figures on the bridge towers. The specific quality of a city that has been continuously inhabited since the 9th century, and that carries that continuity as a physical presence rather than a historical claim. 9 centuries of continuous institutional history, 3 of them under Habsburg authority, 1 under Nazi occupation, 4 decades under Soviet influence, and now the specific institutional moment of a city that has finished the transition and knows what it is. The formation registered this as a calibration reference, more complex than any previous postings water had produced, not just the speed and direction and color of the water, the institutional character of the city the water ran through. Filed. The cover in Prague was a senior research fellow position at an academic institution whose European Security Studies program provided legitimate professional access to the specific institutional networks the posting required. The cover was the deepest the career had used since the Budapest desk cover in 1993. The specific kind of institutional embedding that required genuine academic work to be produced, and that provided, in return, the kind of institutional credibility that allowed access to the former intelligence service networks that the Czech academic environment in 2007 was host to. The genuine academic work was produced. 2 working papers, 1 conference presentation. The institutional credibility was used. 3 meetings with former BIS officers in the first 8 days of the posting before Marta appeared on day 12. Each meeting providing a different segment of the picture that the posting's collection requirements had been designed to complete. The collection requirements themselves were specific and operationally precise in a way that the Warsaw posting's requirements had not been. Warsaw had been a collection requirement that had unexpectedly produced the building on now.This, an accidental finding rather than a targeted one. Prague was a targeted posting. The target was the financial network. The dead drop in Josefov had been operational since day 3 because the financial network's Czech segment was already partially documented in the physical archive from the Warsaw entries, and the additional documentation required a specific kind of financial records access that the Josefov dead drop location provided through a specific contact whose identity is in the physical archive and not in this account. The 11 days before Marta were not wasted. Days. They were the days that produced the 3 dead drop exchanges that had built the Czech segment's documentation to the point where the composite map was possible. The composite map required the Czech segment to be documented before it could be aligned with the Western segment that the Warsaw entries had partially described. Marta walked into the cafe on day 12 because the documentation had reached the point where the Czech side could see the alignment was possible and had decided to make the contact. She had been watching the posting's progress. She had assessed on day 11 that the documentation was sufficient for alignment and had sat down at the northeast corner table on day 12. The specific quality of Marta's operational judgment, the assessment that day. 11 was the moment for contact, rather than day 3, or day 7 was the thing that the 40-second opening statement had not fully conveyed. The timing was not coincidence. The timing was the product of 8 years of analytical work applied to the question of when to disclose and what to disclose and to whom to disclose it. The same question that al-Rashid had applied in 1997 that Karim had applied across 3 years between 2001 and 2003. The timing of disclosure, as itself an operational instrument, Marta had used it correctly. The disclosure on day 12 produced the composite map. The disclosure on day 3 would have produced a different interaction, one in which the documentation was insufficient for alignment and in which the disclosure itself would have been the operative event rather than the alignment. I want to give you the specific operational texture of the second Marta meeting because it contains the moment that the Prague file's most significant finding arrived. The meeting was in a different cafe in the Vinohrady district, the new dead drop location, a cafe that the posting's surveillance detection route had confirmed was clean from the 19th of March, 2007. 1,430 hours. Marta arrived before me, not at my table this time, at a table she had selected, facing the entrance, her own operational geometry rather than mine. Professional acknowledgement of a shifted relationship. The first meeting had been her demonstration of access. The second meeting was a peer interaction. The shift was significant, and the formation registered it. She produced a document, 11 pages. Not Hungarian translation in the margins Czech, with her own annotations in precise Czech bureaucratic shorthand. The document was a BIS financial analysis of the Prague node in the network. The analysis showed, across 4 years of Czech financial records, the specific pattern of transactions that connected the Prague entity to the Western segment of the network. The pattern was not in the transactions themselves. Individual transactions were each individually explicable as legitimate private sector financial activity. The pattern was in the timing, frequency, and counterparty structure of the transactions cross-referenced against the operational calendar of the entity's activities that the BIS had been reconstructing from the network's activity traces since 2003. The cross-reference produced the direct link. The Prague entity's principal, whose identity, the document named in the Czech bureaucratic notation that the BIS used for individuals whose institutional affiliation required discretion, had made 3 specific payments to an intermediary whose own financial records showed payments to the Warsaw Building's Delaware holding company in the months immediately following the building's 2002 activation. 3 payments. 3 months. The timing was precise. The amounts were specific. The intermediary was traceable. And the financial chain ran from the Prague entity's principal to the Warsaw Building's operational infrastructure through a specific set of transactions that Czech financial records had captured and that the BIS analysis had reconstructed. The Prague entity's principal was the trajectory assessment subject. I looked at the document for the appropriate amount of time. Not 11 seconds. This was not catastrophic information in the phone call at 031 2 hours sense. It was a confirmation. The probability assessment at 0.97 was a confirmation of a trajectory assessment that had been building since 1988. Confirmations do not require 11 seconds. They require the specific kind of professional acknowledgement that says, "I understand what this document is and what it means, and I am registering it correctly." I looked at the document for 22 seconds. Then I said, "When was this compiled?" She said, "The final entry is February 28 of this year, 17 days before the meeting. The analysis was current." Filed. The document went into the physical archive through the Vinohrady dead drop that evening. The 22-second document. The direct financial link. The 3 payments. The Warsaw Building connection. The 0.97 probability becoming 0.97 with a documentary evidentiary basis rather than a compound probability basis. Not a pattern of institutional decisions that are individually defensible. A documented financial chain. 11 pages. Czech bureaucratic shorthand. 4 years of BIS analysis. Dated the 28th of February, 2007. The most significant single document the physical archive had received since the October 1993 11 decision handwritten page that had established the first operational link in the trajectory assessment 14 years earlier. And then the 3rd meeting, and the timeline acceleration. And the 11 seconds in the Vinohrady Café on March 28 with the 7-sentence Karim communication, and the Vltava at 1.1 meters per second, and the breath vapor at 1.9 seconds, and the 4 months that had just become 3. I want to give you something about the Vltava that the formation's standard water registration does not contain. Because it belongs in this account, and because the Vltava contains a specific operational metaphor that the previous posting's waters have approached but not fully produced, the Vltava does not go straight, it curves. The Vltava's path through Prague is a series of meanders the river, bending left and right through the city, the old town on one bend, Malá Strana on another, the castle above on the hill, the bridges connecting the bends. A river that meanders is a river that has been in negotiation with its geography for a very long time. The straight rivers, the Rhine, the Potomac, in its canal-regularized form, have been managed. Their paths have been decided. The Vltava has been negotiating. The specific shape of a meander is the product of the river's own momentum, interacting with the soil conditions on each bank, the river eroding where the bank is soft, depositing where the bank is hard, the meander tightening and widening as the conditions change, the river finding the path through its geography that its own momentum and the geography's resistance together produce. The physical archive has been meandering for 14 years. Not going straight toward the threshold curving, negotiating with the institutional geography, finding the path that the documentation's own momentum and the institution's resistance together produce. Budapest and Brussels and Amman and Washington and Istanbul and Beirut and Cairo and Warsaw and Prague, each a curve in the meander, each a negotiation between the documentation's momentum and the specific resistance of each posting's operational environment. The path is not straight. The path is the negotiation. And the negotiation has been producing over 14 years of meander, a path that is converging on the threshold that the entity's own acknowledgments have been mapping. The Vltava converges on the sea eventually. All rivers converge on the sea eventually. The meanders do not change the direction. They change the path. The threshold is the sea. The archive is the river. The dema, archive. The path is what the last 14 years have produced. Filed. The Prague posting produced 5 data points that the physical archive did not have before it began. The composite map of the financial network. The direct financial link between the trajectory assessment subject and the Warsaw operational infrastructure, the BIS's 8-year evidentiary record, the Walsh legal mechanism timeline, and the timeline acceleration from 9 months to 6. 5 data points, each one a grain of sediment in the riverbank that has been accumulating since 1993. 5 grains. After 14 years, 5 more grains felt like exactly what they were, sufficient to produce the specific tipping in the bank's accumulated character that changes the bank from holding to shaping. The water's path through the bank changes when the bank accumulates enough sediment to redirect the current. The Prague grains were the sediment that was beginning to redirect. The bank holds, the water moves, the archive grows, the Vltava curves through the city at 1.1 meters per second and converges across many kilometers of meander on the sea. Received, registered, filed. The Gray Operative, every week, without exception. Start from episode 1. The order is not a suggestion. It never was. The architecture holds. The significance is approaching. Stay in the shadows.